Hello, welcome to the Efficio Spotlight and Procurement podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb, and thank you very much for joining me today. And today, I'm delighted to say we're talking about a topic that actually we've not had the chance to cover in too much detail before, and that is to talk in a little bit more detail about the apparel and fashion industry. And I'm honoured to say that joining me today for that discussion are two industry experts. So firstly is Bryan Wright. Bryan is a board member at Silvert's Adaptive Clothing and Footwear. Silvert is a US and Canadian-based retailer that designs and distributes adaptive clothing and footwear for men and women. Prior to that, he's also held a number of senior procurement and supply chain roles in well-known businesses like Abercrombie & Fitch, JCPenney, and Authority Brands. And also joining me is my Efficio colleague, Danny Wang. So Danny is a principal consultant with us, but he also has experience in the fashion industry, particularly as the operations SVP for sourcing, procurement, and planning at Canada Goose. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me for the conversation today. As an opening question, when you do see fashion and apparel talked about in the press or in other places around sourcing and supply chain issues, it sometimes veer toward the negative aspects of that. And I'm sure we'll come on and pick that up later in our conversation. But I actually wanted to start by opening to get your perspective on, within that industry, what part does procurement and supply chain play in creating competitive strategy and actually being part of a competitive differentiation for brands and for businesses? So, Bryan, if I could start with you and your perspectives on that.
Well, I really enjoy being in sourcing and supply chain in the apparel industry specifically. And one of the areas that I find interesting, I started my career on the indirect procurement side and then moved also to the merchandise sourcing as well. And in apparel specifically, the merchandise sourcing is a little unusual. When you're buying the product, when you're making the decision about who's going to manufacture, who's going to do the cut and sew, where the fabric's going to come from, when you're making those decisions, the product is not necessarily finalized. The design is still in progress. The price may not be able to be resolved completely. So you've got to make a lot of these decisions based on other factors. For those that do it well, it causes us to need to treat the manufacturers as extensions of our own company, to really treat them as partners. And so the apparel companies who really treat their tier 1, tier 2, and potentially tier 3 suppliers as partners are going to do better than the ones who think it's just a commodity. So on the apparel side, you really got to get in there. You got to understand the factories, understand what they're going through, and not just understand it from their perspective, but come back and help your team understand the challenges that the factory has. And I always enjoy that. That's a lot of fun, and it's I think somewhat unique to apparel.
And Danny, what about your perspective on that, and particularly in the context of brands and brands value? How does that translate in our world to the topic of sourcing and supply chain?
It translates very well, actually. Similar to Bryan, I started my career in indirect or the non-merchandise side, and that was, as always, looking at heading up the direct side for Goose. To his point, I had to develop an onboarding process. I had to basically, how do I go out find the right partners to actually work with us? And if you don't have specifications, you don't have anything in place, how do you do that? Because that's what indirect usually does, right? Here's a playbook. You go out, you find the best, you have your criteria. So Bryan, probably similar to what you've done, I've had to go on the reverse saying, how do I develop an initial survey or relationship with a bunch of potential great suppliers in there, whether it's based on there are other brands that they work with that are similar to us, right? Whether there's a linkage in terms of, because, of course, depending on the apparel brand you're working for, some are more luxurious, some are more lifestyle, some are more commodity based. So you have to find that right nuance in terms of, will the team appreciate this other supplier or partner because they've worked with similar brands? And then what's tricky, because it's always going to be the sales pitch really. The salespeople want to get involved and they say, oh, we can do everything you want to do. But the culture fit I find was incredibly nuanced to navigate. You had to find the right culture at the leadership of that partner that's going to invest in a year or two of hardship. And when I say hardship, because they don't know how you operate, they don't know what you may do well, what you may not do well. They may be confronted with having 50 people contact them at one point in time because they all want to engage with a brand new supplier and do all these new designs and developments. So you have to understand that they have to invest it. And the one thing I've kind of done as the litmus test of this, what I call the anti-sell. At the end of the onboarding, the factory audits, looking at, price comparisons, doing sample analysis. I would do the anti-sale at the very end with the ownership or the executive team that partners in, saying, are you willing to actually invest in us for a year or two without making money? Because that's how long you're going to need to kind of really get to know us. And there's going to be ups and downs. We're going to be probably the worst client you're ever going to have, the worst customer, because maybe we don't know what we're doing. So I go through that to see kind of their expression and body language, because if they've been in the right industry, they know that every single brand is so unique to itself, and there's going to be ups and downs. And are they willing to invest and realize that? Because I guarantee you, 6 or 12 months down the road, it's going to be hard. I'm going to have to go back to them and saying, we're still going to need your help. And guess what? We are actually going to have to cut those volumes because that product line didn't sell. So those are the things that I need to prep up. And when you find those unique partners that are willing to see the long-term vision with you, that's going to be successful, but it's hard.
I think that's a really good call, Danny. I may try that myself in the future, warning that factory owner from the get-go that it's going to be 6 to 12 months before they're going to make any money. Because I think that's right. It takes a long time for everybody to figure out how to work well together, how to work smoothly together, both sides. And the bigger the language barriers, the more challenging it is.
And Bryan, from you, obviously lots of experience in lots of different businesses. From your experience, what are the brands and the businesses that do this well? How are they going about this topic, approaching suppliers, looking at supply chains? What is it that the top performers are doing?
I can't speak for all the top performers because I think it gets narrowed right down to different teams. But I think that you've got to get out of your office and you've got to go to the factories and spend time, not just a quick factory tour and be done, but you've got to spend some time in country. You've got to, as much as possible, and really develop the personal relationship with absolutely the senior leaders within the organizations, but preferably a level down lower. And in a best case scenario, you'd spend time on the factory floor that's meaningful. But just as Danny's pointing, you've got to get to a point where the factory owners understand they're not going to make a lot of money in the beginning. So if I have a relationship with the factory owners, the middle management, the odds of us working through all of the challenges well that are going to come up, whether it's lack of profitability or a change in what the orders are going to be, it's so much more likely to be something we can work through if we have a relationship to base that on. And it can't just be a relationship between the senior leader in the organization and the senior leader of the factory. You got to take it down into the organizations a couple levels, preferably their middle management and your middle management.
Yeah. And James, we touched on at the start, like for you to ask a bunch of men and women in the street, the kind of cliche around the fashion industry. One of them is it's all about low-cost countries. You're passing stuff out to factories and your sweatshops and you're working people. You have both lived and worked in the industry. What's your experience? Is that cliche fair, or actually is the industry a force for good, or can be a force for good?
I'm a huge fan of this conversation because I think the public perception or what gets put out is inaccurate. I've been in dozens and dozens of factories, maybe hundreds, and I've never used what I would consider a sweatshop at all. The worst factories that I've been in, bar none, and have worked in have been in the United States, unquestionably. But that's not even close. The best factories that I've been in have been in Asia. And they're clean, they're modern, they are very reasonable work environments. They are a place. What's nice about apparel, the equipment is not that complicated. Yeah, it requires some practice, it requires some skill, but it's not rocket science to run in the various sewing equipment. And so the apparel industry trains a group of low-income folks in a low-income country where their next best choice would literally be farming or really awful jobs. And it provides jobs particularly to women in these environments, which they're going to have fewer other choices. It brings them into a very reasonable environment, trains them. It not only provides work for them in the apparel industry, but that becomes the foundation for industrialization for that entire city and that city potentially for that entire country. And we've seen this as the beginning of industrialization historically in lots of other countries like the Northeast in the United States. I think that the idea that there's a lot of sweatshops out there is grossly exaggerated, and it's unfortunate because I think the apparel industry is fantastic and one of those industries that helps bring the poorest people in the world out of poverty.
Yeah. Danny, is apparel a force for good?
No, I would definitely agree. I think if I look at all the factories I visited, even the ones in North America versus the ones in low cost geographies, most of the constraints, especially in North America, is that you can't find skilled labor. So there's an active recruitment and training session across several months to actually train individuals up and to kind of get them to that skill level. And when I think about traditional sweatshop, it's about affordability. But in today's day and age of quality, a sweatshop won't get away with that stuff because they're not efficient. They're dirty and there's going to be quality defects. And, you know, to Brian's point, if you look at some of the larger Asian factories, they're clean, they're semi-automated. They've got tons of people that are trained because they know if you're going to drive efficiency, drive optimization, that's how you're going to be able to eliminate the quality defects and keep that margin that you're pricing into it. So it's very rare that I've ever come across a true sweatshop. I think the only things I've seen is maybe, you know, out of the mechanical areas of tool and die making. I've seen some of those where a little bit more messy, but in apparel, you won't be able to get away with that. And I think it does raise the elevations, the skilled labor pool, especially, you know, it's funny that you say about how maybe in the States, you've seen some sweatshops. I've heard that analogy as well, that actually when compliance teams and they go audit, and like any reputable apparel company has audit teams that will go on the ground and they'll go through everything from ESG, compliance, everything. And the one that actually comes back a little bit worse for wear are the ones in some, you know, some US cities versus the ones up there in India or China.
And I say this is not third hand. So one of the worst factories I've been in is a factory I worked in just after I got done with high school, a glass factory in Toledo, Ohio, 35 years ago or so. And it was miserably hot. It was dangerous. People got injured. It was dirty. It was just the worst environment possible. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. In contrast, these cut and sew factories in around the world, I'd be perfectly happy with my teenage kids working there. It's hard work, but it's reasonable.
It kind of neatly brings on to the topic of tariffs. Let's be honest, very difficult for our podcast to stay ahead of the tariff news given our release schedule. So
it's changed overnight, I think.
Yes. But without going into the specifics, I guess one of the assumptions about the US's particularly approach to tariffs at the moment is it's a tool designed to create a manufacturing capability within the country. Like, as experts, I'd love to get your perspective on that in the apparel fashion industry. And Danny, maybe.
I know this well because, you know, with my previous company, we were manufacturing in North America and we had to set up factories. So, and things had moved off to Asia, probably, I think in that demographic, at least 10 years, everything was moved off. So as we started building those factories up in North America, it's hard. The space is not an issue. You can always find space, right? And we're not talking about massive machinery, stamping machines. We're talking about sewing machines, right, Brian? These are relatively light, so you don't need a deep concrete base for them. But it's the labor pool because you have to find the people. And most of the folks that we would have to employ would be, you know, those that were new immigrants, those that were needed part-time work, taking care of family. And most of them were, you know, mothers and grandmothers and wives that from the immigrant pool that we had to pull from. So you get to find that demographic first, right? Then you have to basically spend time. If they've never touched a needle or touched a machine, it will take sometimes, I would say anywhere between 3 to 8 months to get to a scalability that they can perform at pace. And of course, it takes several years if they're going to be graduated to do more complicated sewing. So it is a skill trap. And if you don't have that pool of resources, you're never going to be able to automate. There's no robot or AI that's going to be actually be able to navigate the nuances of ever-changing designs. And that's what fashion is. You're not going to take the same shirt, same jacket over and over again. You're going to make it something special and something dynamic. So it's going to be an ever-changing industry. Brian, what are your thoughts?
Well, I've been intrigued with the idea of manufacturing apparel in the United States for many years. We have some manufacturing that occurs here in LA. I've done some denim and tried to do some other things. And I've been in facilities that tried to take advantage of tremendous amounts of technology, including robots all over the floor, moving trim from one location to another and optimizing how you're training your sewing operators. Even the most technologically advanced factories that I've ever seen still hired immigrants or newly arrived folks who had a background of sewing from the time that they were children. So we've lost that skill set. But even then, it's very hard to make the math work on the sewing side. On the cutting side, you can, under certain circumstances, you can make that work.
Right.
On the cutting side, you can automate enough of that. You can do that with equipment and technology rather than just labor. But the sewing is still something that requires a human with a trained skill set. And the labor cost differences between the US or Canada and some of the lower cost countries is just really huge.
Yeah. And just my last question, which is a deeply unfair one, given what we just said about tariffs and the moving nature of the conversation. But as experts in the industry, as you look forward from here, what do you see the next few years holding for the industry?
Well, I think the next few months, for sure, is going to be a lot of confusion.
Right.
And I think the smart players in the industry over the next year have got to build supply chains that have a lot of options. So
Right.
I don't know what the right answer is. Nobody knows what the right answer is today because tomorrow it's going to be a different tariff environment.
Yeah.
So how do we build supply chains that have 3 or 4 different options that are all profitable, that we can implement quickly and adjust to 3 or 4 different likely scenarios?
I like that answer. And I was going to say, diversify your supply chain, because I think if you segment your product line between those of the higher margins that you can afford a more localized opportunity in a smaller volume, then you can establish that kind of manufacturing presence. But you really have to segment in terms of your high margin, low volume, high volume. And if you have that mix ready, you can develop those countries of origin. Because I know, where everybody was moving off to China, then China was down to Vietnam and Vietnam down to Cambodia. That's sort of the trend it was for a lot of the higher volume aspects. But
Yeah.
now with advent of tariffs, localized manufacturing, either local or nearshoring. And I think if you can justify the price point for those premium or luxury goods, that would be the only way that you could really test out and build those manufacturing footprint closer to home. Otherwise, you're going to have to elevate all the pricing because nobody has the scale quite yet. Nobody has technical expertise quite yet. Yeah. So I think it's an interesting world. I think it's tons of opportunities for people in procurement supply chain, right? Because it's going to be basically, you can choose your own adventure and nobody's going to say it's wrong.
Bryan, Danny, thank you so much for your time today. It was a really interesting conversation to say on an industry and a topic we haven't had the chance to talk about too much before. So thank you for your time and your thoughts. It's really appreciated. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give us a click on the follow button on your chosen podcast platform. We'd also love to hear your views on either future topics or indeed if you've got any thoughts on future guests that we should look to get onto the podcast. Thanks again. See you next time.